No words necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me very particular pleasure to introduce Patti Smith.
Hello, everyone. Just have to put on my spectacles. Hermann Hesse won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1946. I decided to read an excerpt from his masterwork, Magister Ludi, only last night during the Nobel Prize concert, as I was very moved by the solo violinist, the orchestra performing Beethoven's Pastoral, and the closing words of the conductor. The novel traces the life of one of the glass bead game's greatest magisters, Joseph Knecht. The first passage tells of his youthful meeting with a venerable music master. "Do you happen to know what a fugue is?" the master asked. Joseph had already heard fugues, but had not studied them in class. "Very well," the master said, "then I'll show you. You'll grasp it quicker if we make a fugue ourselves." He played a brief passage, a fragment of a song's melody. The boy looked at the clever white fingers, saw the course of the development faintly mirrored in the master's concentrated expression, while his eyes remained quiet under half-closed lids. Joseph's heart swelled with veneration, with love for the master. His ears drank in the fugue. It seemed to him that he was hearing music for the first time in his life. Behind the music being created in his presence, he sensed the world of mind, the joy-giving harmony of law and freedom, of service and rule. He surrendered himself and vowed to serve that world and this master. In those few minutes, he saw himself in his life, saw the whole cosmos guided, ordered, and interpreted by the spirit of music. The old man slowly raised himself from the piano stool, fixed those blue eyes piercingly with unimaginable friendliness upon him, and said, "Making music together is the best way for two people to become friends. There is none easier. That is a fine thing. I hope you and I shall become friends." Years later, when Joseph rose himself to become the great master of the glass bead game, he visited the music master shortly before he died. This is how he describes it. "You are tiring yourself, Joseph," the music master said softly, and at that moment he laid his hand upon my arm. It was light as a butterfly, and he looked into my eyes and smiled. At that moment I was conquered. Something of his cheerful silence, something of his patience and calm passed into me, and I suddenly understood the old man and the direction his nature had taken, away from people and toward silence, away from words and toward music, away from ideas and toward unity, and for the first time grasped the meaning of his smile, his radiance. I cannot communicate to you what went on between us or what was exchanged. Certainly, no words were spoken. I felt him and the course of his growth from the time he first entered my life when I was a boy up to this present moment. His was a life of devotion and work, but free of obstructions, free of ambition, and full of music. It was as if, by becoming a musician and music master, he had chosen music as one of the ways towards man's highest goal, inner freedom, purity, perfection, and as though ever since making that choice, he had done nothing but let himself be more and more permeated, transformed, and purified by music. His entire self, from his pianist's hands and his vast musician's memory to all the body and soul, to his pulses and breathing, to his sleep and dreaming, so that he was now a manifestation, a personification of music. I experienced what radiated from him, or what surged back and forth between him and me, like rhythmic breathing, entirely as music, which absorbs everyone who enters its magic circle, as a song from many voices absorbs an entering voice. Perhaps a non-musician would have perceived this grace in different images. An astronomer might have seen it as a moon circling around a planet, or a philologist heard it as some magical, primal language containing all meanings. I was a wing in heaven blue, on the ocean, soared in the rain, and I was free. I needed nobody. It was beautiful. It was beautiful. I was an image in another eye, and I saw nothing, no future at all. Yet I was free. I needed nobody. It was beautiful. It was beautiful. And if there's one thing could do for you, you'd be a wing in heaven blue. And if there's one thing could do for you, you'd be a wing in heaven blue. Thank you. Hi.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zainab Badawi, and it's my great pleasure to be engaging in this conversation with two giants. I won't be standing on your shoulders, but that's the name of this conversation, standing on the shoulders of giants, but I'll be sitting between you instead, which is far more preferable, I think. Patti Smith, really absolutely wonderful to be here with you. As so many people here admired you from afar for many, many years, and now from close up.
Here I am.
Yeah, yep. Great.
Here we are.
Yes, and Professor Angus Deaton, whom I'm sure many of you know, was last year's Nobel laureate for economics, and you won your prize for poverty, consumption and welfare. But aren't you relieved? I'm not going to be asking you about any of that today, slightly different things.
I know something about it.
You know something about poverty, consumption and welfare. Well, you can tell me later. Thank you. So, Patti Smith, obviously your career is one that's been applauded in just about every corner of the world, but what I think has struck so many people about you is the fact that you have married poetry with your music. And that is something which a lot of people have derived a great deal of enjoyment from. In terms of influences and influencers, perhaps give us an idea of what has inspired you.
Well, first of all, funny enough, when I was a little girl, I wanted to be a scientist and help the world. So I'm so glad that you are doing the work that you are doing, because it was a little beyond me. But I do what I can. And when I realized that I was never going to be a scientist, I found that my vocation was writing. And I read so much as a young girl, and I was inspired and influenced by, everyone I read, whether it was Paul de Croof or Louisa May Alcott. And as I evolved and wanted to perform my poetry, I was very influenced by Allen Ginsberg and Bob Dylan, people that brought all of their poetic imagery and merged it with a worldview, with the things that concern us all. And so I have many, many influences, but there's two of them.
Well, you've mentioned Bob Dylan, and I believe you toured very briefly with him in 1995, in the mid-90s, and of course he's this year's literature laureate, and I know you're a big fan of Bob Dylan too, Professor Sir Angus Deaton. So did you find the fact that his music, like Patti's, has this, message in it? There's a kind of almost political activism, you could say. It's not just the Beatles, I love you and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think John Lennon would have something to say about that.
The early Beatles. Sorry. The early Beatles, maybe.
Well, certainly, Bob Dylan was an inspiration to much of my generation. And there was certainly this sense of global justice, which was a very important part of his songs. And his music always seemed to me to somewhere that came from somewhere completely different, in that it's like listening to Mozart, where you feel that Mozart is sort of a vessel for what you're listening to, because it's hard to believe that a human being like the rest of us could have constructed this. And Bob Dylan at that time seemed to encapsulate for many of us the airs of the time, the views of the time, everything that was in the air at that time. And, he obviously didn't tell me to become an economist or whatever, but, he certainly did, like many of us, make us want to make the world a better place. And I found my way very indirectly into doing that. And, like Patti, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a scientist. And then I discovered that reading books was my way into this. And so I was certainly very inspired by that very early on, and was living in a place where there was not a lot of that around.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because it's not just people, but it's often circumstances that can influence you. And I'm sure you won't mind my saying that you have written about how you were brought up in rather impoverished circumstances. Your father was a coal miner originally, your mother a waitress. And in fact, not only did she not encourage you to study, she actively discouraged you to study, and you kind of, in a sense, rebelled against your circumstances because you wanted to do something. So circumstances can also really fashion
certainly very,
the future.
Very important. My mother had been a nurse and then was this homemaker, so I don't think she was ever a waitress.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
There's many things about my mother
Your
I don't
mother
know.
was
Your
the
mother
waitress.
was the waitress. We'll get that straight. I only rebelled against half of it because my father, having been not educated himself, was very, very keen that I be educated. My mother didn't really see the point in it. But in circumstances, too, I was fortunate to grow up in the city of Edinburgh in Scotland, which was, in some ways a very deprived place. But it had this, going back to the Scottish Renaissance, very much this history of philosophy, of literature, of scientific endeavor. And it was a place where you really were encouraged to believe in yourself, to read, to understand. And it also, literature in the libraries in Edinburgh offered me a vision of an exciting, bright world out there that was very different from the world in which I was growing up.
Does that resonate with you?
Well, I was from a lower middle class family. I lived in a rural community, and there wasn't much work. The people struggled, but I was surrounded by my household was there was always dialogue, books everywhere, and I was very stimulated by the energy in my family. They were open-minded. We didn't have anything, but I had a very open-minded upbringing. But I wanted to say one thing. When you were talking about listening to Bob Dylan when you were young and choosing your vocation, today I was reading things about what your field is and all the things that you do, and it made me think of lines that I was learning in Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, because he said he wrote in '63 or something, where the people are many, where their hands are all empty, where hunger is ugly, where souls are forgotten. And that is the way, an artist does his work in articulating the troubles of our world, and then the scientists and the researchers and people as yourself actually go out to do something about it. So it's in that way we're all hopefully working toward the same thing.
Mm. So you use your music, obviously, as you said, Bob Dylan has, to kind of get the message, anti-poverty, and you could be described, I suppose, as an activist. We know that in one presidential American election, you backed Ralph Nader, the Green candidate. And I wonder if, because there's been a great deal of conversation and debate since the victory of Donald Trump in the presidential election, with people talking about how that reflects how America perhaps has become or is a polarized society, and then you've got two very different visions.
Well, I don't know exactly what the question is, but yes, we are very polarized. We are historically polarized. Even the way we vote, only half of the country really votes, and the other half are polarized. So when we have a president, one doesn't always get a sense of who is voting for that person. But the election of Donald Trump tells us many things about our country. One is there is a very strong dissatisfied faction who feels that no one is speaking to them, and also the rise and importance of social media and even celebrity culture in our country. So this election, which was conducted very poorly, cost huge amounts of money that should have gone really to the underprivileged, and the results should be a real wake-up call for the whole world, and especially for my country and future candidates, that you have to understand you're speaking to all the people, not a faction of the people. And especially you've got to speak to people who are dissatisfied, feel marginalized, and there can't be an elitist concept in democracy.
I mean, Sir Angus, we saw in the Brexit debate how expert opinion, particularly of the economists, who by and large, at least the mainstream ones, backed the Remain campaign, and we saw how obviously the vote went the other way, that people were choosing to disregard expert opinion, as it were, in favour of something else. And Patti has just talked about how, you can't ignore the voices as they speak. Is that something that concerns you, that experts perhaps don't quite have the same currency that they have had in the past?
Well, that's certainly true, that experts don't have as much currency. And in many ways, they don't deserve as much currency because they've claimed territory that is not their own. And they've sort of tried to substitute expertise for politics and saying you should behave this way or you should do this way, and imposing solutions on people where science really doesn't have the answer at all. But the first thing I was going to say to you was, you know, when you look at this, what do you feel? And what I feel is, boy, did we do a really bad job. You know, in some sense, you know, we came out of, you know, when we were talking about Bob Dylan or what we felt in the 60s, there was this sort of feeling of a world that had gone badly wrong and that many, many things needed to be corrected. And many of us were inspired in very many different ways to go into music or to go into art or to go into economics or whatever to try and make that world a better place. And I think we've learned a lot since then. I mean, I certainly know a lot more than I did then. And I think, you know, the fields in which I work have made a lot of progress too. But we've somehow failed to, either this doesn't properly connect with these people, or we haven't tailored it in a way that's relevant to them. One of the things I think is very badly broken, and I think this is true in both the UK and the US, is that the working class has very little political representation today. There used to be unions in America. Nowadays, there are no unions in America, to first approximation. In Britain, the Labour Party used to consist of people who were elected from the unions to represent working people in Parliament. Nowadays, the Labour Party is educated liberal elites who think of themselves as representing those people. They are not all of those people. And I think a lot of what's happened in Washington is partly the two political parties have moved into where the money is and away from where the people are.
You've done a lot of research on the States and how white communities in the parts of the states that they occupy form a disproportionate number of the disaffected, the premature deaths, and coincidentally also those who backed Trump mostly. So that seems to be an interesting area of discussion.
There's real distress in those communities.
We've talked about some of the public things, but I know when I spoke to you briefly yesterday, Patti, about what you'd like to talk about and what has shaped you and influenced you, you said, motherhood is something that's very important to me. And
it's very funny because when I was a young girl, all I wanted to be as I grew up was an artist. I never thought about having children. I thought there were many children in the world, and I just wanted to create art. I just wanted to do my work. But I fell in love, and my husband really wanted children, and so I had a son and daughter, and I'm a responsible person, and I thought, well, I'll raise my children. But a very strange thing happened. I fell in love with my children. I was the oldest of 4 children and helped raise my siblings, and it came very natural to me. Now my son and daughter, their father died young, and so I have a strong bond with my children, and I learn from them and are influenced by them continually. My son, because my son is just a good man. He's a simple man, very good, and he's got a moral quality that always makes me question and remember why I'm doing things. And my daughter is more of a social, more of an activist than I. She works for awareness of climate change. She works with immigrants. She works with Tibetan and Nepalese musicians. She's constantly working to help others. And when I get too, wrapped up in my own world and just in my own solitude, both of them remind me of, certain human responsibilities. My son is a father, and so he comes to me for advice about his child, And my daughter is an activist, and she comes to me counseling me. You forgot to recycle. What are you doing today? You should do a benefit here. So I am constantly, I have two very good influences right in my own backyard.
You've also influenced them along with your late husband, Fred Smith, who of course was very famous guitarist. I think Rolling Stone magazine said he's one of the 100 greatest guitarists of all time. And your son plays the guitar, Jackson.
He's 101 at least.
and good. And Jessie, your daughter, also plays the piano. So obviously you and their late father have also influenced them. Is that something that pleases you, that they've picked up this influence?
Their father was the real musician. I sing, but I don't really have any accomplishment in an instrument. I really am more of a writer, performer. They really channel their father, and when we're together, the three of us can always be with him through music. He has never really departed for us, and when we're playing together, I can hear his tones in my son's guitar. I can hear his creativity in my daughter's choices. And but I feel his influence remains always with them. It's within their blood. Mm-hmm. And I know the ways that I've influenced them, but it makes me even happier, truthfully, when I see his influence upon them.
Well, I'm sure you have influenced so many people and given great pleasure to so many people and inspiration all over the world. Just a final word for you, Sir Angus. Bob Dylan, this year's Literature Laureate, but he's not here. A matter of regret for you?
Very much so, yes.
You would have liked to have shaken the great man's hand?
I would have loved to have shaken his hand, yes. And for me, it's a wonderful thing, because I think, you know, Nobel's original intention of doing good for mankind also depends on how many people you do good for. And, you know, not everybody likes Bob Dylan as much as I do, but he's changed and influenced millions of people's lives, and the recognition of that by the Nobel Foundation, I think, is just a wonderful thing.
Professor Sir Angus Deaton, thank you. And Patti Smith, of course, thank you very much indeed to you. Thank you. Thank you.
So just a few more minutes left, and it's become a bit of a tradition that we devote the last minutes of the Nobel Week Dialogue to hearing from the